Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Lolita Buckner-Ennis. I'm the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, and it is my tremendous honor and pleasure to welcome you to the 47th Annual Austin W. Scott Jr. Lecture titled Artificial Intelligence and the Law, and it will be presented by our own esteemed Professor Harry Surden. This lecture is co-sponsored by Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship, which is one of our interdisciplinary centers here at the law school. As we gather, I want to take a moment to honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado Law School is on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now the state of Colorado, including, of course, our own campus here at the University of Colorado. Let me tell you a little bit about the Austin W. Scott Jr. Lecture. This lecture is, of course, not surprisingly named for Austin Scott, who was a member of this law school for 20 years. His scholarly work was in the fields of criminal law and procedure. In 1973, one of our previous deans, Don W. Sears, established this lecture to take place every year in honor of Professor Scott. Each year, the dean of the law school selects a member of our faculty engaged in a significant scholarly project to lecture on their research. To be chosen is indeed a great recognition, because I am here to tell you we have a tremendous faculty, and so it's not an easy selection. I am so very proud, however, that Professor Surden will deliver this year's lecture. Professor Surden focuses upon legal informatics, artificial intelligence in law, that includes machine learning in law, legal automation, and issues concerning self-driving autonomous vehicles. He also studies intellectual property law with a substantive focus on patents and copyright and information law privacy. Before coming to CU Law, Professor Surden was a resident fellow at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, Codex, at Stanford Law School. In that capacity, Professor Surden conducted interdisciplinary research with collaborators from the Stanford School of Engineering, exploring the application of computer technology towards improving the legal system. He received his law degree from Stanford University with honors. Today, Professor Surden is one of the leading scholars in the field of artificial intelligence and the law. His works have been widely cited in both computer science and law. Professor Surden brings to the table a rare set of skills for a law professor. He analyzes technology issues, as he has both a technology and a law background, having previously worked as a professional software engineer prior to entering the field of law. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation, and so those of you who are in person, you may raise your hands and a mic will be handed to you. Our virtual participants may use the Q&A feature at the bottom of their Zoom screen to submit questions. And so, without further ado, I bring you our own Professor Harry Surden. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Ennis, for that introduction and for those kind words. It's truly an honor for me to be here giving the law school's Austin Scott Lecture. This is a talk with an incredible history. I stand in the footsteps of many of my outstanding colleagues who have given this talk here in past years, some of whom are here tonight, and I gratefully acknowledge them. And of course, I acknowledge with admiration and respect Professor Austin Scott, for whom this lecture is named, a beloved professor for many years who gave so much to this institution. And I'm so thankful to the Dean for inviting me here to give this talk tonight. And putting together an event like this takes a lot of hard work. So in that spirit, I want to thank the outstanding law school staff who made this talk possible, including Yesenia Delgado, the law school's event coordinator, our amazing law school IT staff, Teresa Cubberly and Lionel Wynn, and the Flatiron's team who helped provide support for this event. And also I want to thank the many law students, faculty and staff who work so hard to put this together. I also want to thank my friends and family, many of whom are in this room, for all their encouragement over the years, and without whose support and love, I would most certainly not be here today. And finally, I want to thank all of you attending both in person and online from near and far. I deeply appreciate your sharing your limited time with me tonight. So this talk will be about artificial intelligence in law. And before discussing what artificial intelligence is and what its relationship to law is, you might be forgiven for wondering, why are we talking about artificial intelligence, a technology, at a law school, an educational institution dedicated to the training of new lawyers? So to answer this very question, it's important to highlight two broad themes of my own academic research into the intersection of law and technology, and which were informed by my own previous career as a software engineer before entering law. So the first theme is that law and technology actually interrelate in fascinating ways. It's important to focus on how laws regulate technology, but it's equally important to focus upon how technology affects law. So many law professors focus mostly on the first, how law regulates technology. For instance, the laws that tell companies what they can or cannot do with your private information, or the laws that allow platforms like Twitter to moderate content without fear of liability. But less attention tends to be paid at law schools to how technology affects the practice, administration, application of law itself. But it does. Technology affects how judges make decisions, how lawyers practice law, and how we, as the users of law, interact with the law. So law affects technology, but technology also affects the law. So point number one, it's crucial to understand this subtle and nuanced dynamic of how each affects the other. The second theme I want to relate that's been part of my research is that one must first seek to understand. So we have to first seek to understand how a technology actually works before we can say something sensible about how it should change or be regulated. As we will discuss, many bad laws have come about from misunderstanding technology or from having an unrealistic understanding of how technologies actually work. So this is our second theme. We must first seek to understand. So circling back to my earlier question, why discuss artificial intelligence and technology at a law school? We can bring that together. We are in the business of training lawyers, but our students will be out there in the field of law. And once they are lawyers, the students that we will train will be at the forefront about giving advice about laws and creating new laws that affect technologies like artificial intelligence. So that's the side of law regulating technology. But also in their own legal practice and the practice and administration of law, they will be encountering technologies like artificial intelligence. It will affect their practice, how they advise their clients, how the law itself is administrated by judges. So even at law schools, we need to be aware of the technologies that affect us in our practice. Second, we must seek to understand. We must seek to understand artificial intelligence. And tonight, we will, in broad strokes, understand how artificial intelligence works before we form an opinion about it. So we will take some time in this talk, and I'd say the majority or a large portion of this talk is dedicated to providing in broad strokes an understanding of the technology and how it works before we seek to opine about how it affects the law and society. And the goal of this is so we can all make informed decisions about the technologies that we interact with our lives, and so our students in turn can adapt to the technologies flexibly as the world and society and law changes beneath their feet. So let me give you a little outline of my talk and how it will proceed. There will be 4 parts. I'll start by talking about what artificial intelligence is and also what it is not. And then we'll look at the aspect of how artificial intelligence is affecting law, the administration, the practice, and the use of law. I will then turn to how law is affecting artificial intelligence, the way in which laws and some contemporary topics in which laws are regulating artificial intelligence. And then we'll seek to make some meaning out of all this. What does this mean, if anything, as these two interplays? So let us begin with part one. And before examining the interplay between artificial intelligence and law, it makes sense really to ask a more basic question: what is artificial intelligence? And somewhat surprisingly, there's no single, or otherwise known as AI, and I'll be referring to artificial intelligence as AI quite often here on. So somewhat surprisingly, there is no single description of AI that most people would agree with. And that's because it's a complicated topic. So we're going to take several different strategies for getting a broad understanding of AI by approaching the topic from a bunch of different angles. We're going to start with a broad definition, and then we're going to look at the kind of tasks today that AI is being used and applied for. We're then going to explore the limits of AI, what contemporary AI technology actually cannot do. And then finally, we're going to take a deeper look at the underlying technologies that make up AI to get a broad sense of how they work. And hopefully, we will emerge from this deep dive with a broader and better understanding of what AI is by examining this complex topic from multiple angles. As mentioned above, the phrase artificial intelligence actually has many different meanings, and it means multiple things to different people. So I won't attempt to get into all the various definitions that have been proposed. However, I find one useful definition of artificial intelligence is the following. Artificial intelligence is using computers or technology to solve problems, make predictions, or automated decisions or actions for tasks that, when done by people, typically require intelligence. Okay, so let's dive into that definition a little bit more to see if we can make sense of it. What are the tasks that require intelligence? For example, we normally associate tasks such as playing chess, translating languages, driving cars, a whole bunch of other activities. These are all tasks that are thought to involve some aspect of intelligence when humans do them. So when a person plays chess, translates language, drives a car, they're thought to engage in a series of higher order cognitive and brain processes that are all loosely associated with the kind of blanket term intelligence. These processes include abstract reasoning, planning, vision, analysis, making analogies, understanding concepts, common sense judgment, etc. So if we have one of these tasks that, when humans do them, require some of these higher order cognitive processes such as reasoning, planning, or common sense, we call that an artificial intelligence task. However, one crucial point is that computers solve these tasks very differently than humans do. A computer drives a car by a very different set of techniques than a human does, and that's become very important when we understand the limits of AI. So that's one way of thinking about AI, a set of tasks that, when humans do it, normally requires some aspect traditionally associated with intelligence. So let me give you a caveat. This is not a perfect description of AI. For instance, and it doesn't cover all AI activities. For instance, there are some AI activities that a human can never do. So AI systems, for example, can spot credit card fraud among billions of transactions. That's something a human can never do. Nonetheless, it's a pretty good working definition for our purposes, because many, if not most, AI tasks are focused on providing some degree of automation or computerized analysis for human activities that have historically been associated with thinking, perception, reasoning, or judgment. Okay, so now let's take our other attempt to see AI from a different angle by looking at the kind of tasks AI is being used for today. So one common task AI is being used for today is automated speech and language recognition. We see these in common devices like Amazon's Alexa or Apple's Siri. Another common feature we see are recommendation systems. When you go to Netflix and it suggests you might like a certain movie, what it's doing is it's looking at your past movie browsing patterns and trying to find people like you and using statistics and math to kind of match you up with people it thinks like you to make suggestions based upon what they liked. Another area that AI has achieved some success is in the area of games. These are games with sort of limited rules like chess or Go. 25 years ago, an AI system shocked the world by beating the world chess champion Garry Kasparov for the first time ever. That was thought not to be possible. These days, the mediocre chess program that you can run in your laptop can defeat the world's greatest chess champion, no contest. Another area that AI has been used is in the area of prediction, simulation, and forecasting. In areas of medicine, AI has been used to develop drugs or simulate drug interactions, weather forecasting, prediction. AI is used a lot for prediction in various areas, including in elections, for better or for worse. Transportation, this is another big area of AI. So, we've probably all heard and maybe sometimes seen self-driving or autonomous cars. These rely very heavily on the most modern AI techniques. One area that people don't realize AI is heavily involved is in airplane autopilot. So the vast increase in safety that we see today, there are very few commercial airline accidents compared to the way they used to happen in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in large part due to AI automation in terms of takeoff and landing. One area of AI that's gotten a lot of interest recently is generative art. These are systems that were more or less built by scanning lots of art that were and graphics, millions of existing images and works of art created by people. And these systems can use these inputs of millions of human-created images, combine them and mix them together and produce new and novel pieces of art like the ones above. And in fact, the one on the right actually won a contest for the best artwork to some controversy. So that piece of music was not created by Scott Joplin, but by an AI system. And it was created by a professor named David Cope, who developed a system that could analyze the past music of various musicians, like Scott Joplin or Mozart, Beethoven, and detect the crucial patterns that are characteristic of that musician and create new and novel pieces in the style of that musician. Today, AI-generated music is actually fairly common. There's a bunch of websites that are out there that'll do it. Another area of interest is AI text generation, and this is something we'll be talking about a lot tonight. So what you see here is a piece of novel text developed by a system called GPT-3, which I'll be talking about a lot, by a company or an organization called OpenAI. And what OpenAI did was they basically took the entire internet and all the books they could find and loaded it up in an AI system using something called deep learning. And GPT-3, this system can produce really interesting, novel writing under certain circumstances. So this is a short story written by this AI system where the prompt was something like, tell me about Twitter in the 1800s, which is kind of nonsense, but it produced a somewhat coherent story. Now, it should be noted that there's a little bit of cherry picking in systems like this where they do actually produce a lot of nonsense, as we'll see. But every once in a while, they'll produce something quite interesting like that. And this is actually quite an impressive step. These generative text systems are much better than they used to be. So these are all fascinating examples of AI systems in use today. And by looking at the tasks that AI is being used for, it provides us one way of understanding AI. But as interesting as these examples that I've shown you are, they all have extreme limits as to what they can do. These technologies are based upon limited principles that work well only in very specific, limited contexts. And until we understand these limits, we risk misunderstanding AI and its actual capabilities and thinking it can do much more than it can. So our next wave of understanding AI will be through understanding its limits. And we're going to be discussing what artificial intelligence is not. And in doing so, we're going to be distinguishing what artificial intelligence is from what many people think artificial intelligence is. So when many lay people hear the term artificial intelligence, they imagine that today's AI technology involves thinking machines, machines that think like people. And this view of thinking machines is sometimes called strong AI or artificial general intelligence. And if computers had strong AI, if such systems existed, which they don't, such a system would be able to think or talk like a human at a level that surpasses, meets or surpasses a human, and might be able to engage in arbitrary conversation, discuss philosophy, engage in abstract reasoning, all the features that we associate with human intelligence. But I want to emphasize that strong AI is decidedly what we do not have today. Today's most advanced AI algorithms cannot think, they can't replicate or approach human higher order cognitive skills such as abstract reasoning, conversation, et cetera. And as we will see, a typical 2-year-old has more advanced cognitive ability and judgment than the most advanced AI system. So why do people think that AI involves thinking machines? Well, unfortunately, as we will see, there are headlines from the media and advertising from tech companies that make this view. You know, IBM talks about their cognitive computing platforms. AI startups tout their robo-lawyers and things about natures. Some pundits in the media garner attention worrying about the coming days of super intelligence or super intelligent AIs. So I spend a lot of time looking at the state of the art of AI and looking at the evidence. And in my opinion, looking very closely at the evidence at the state of AI research, there's no evidence that we're anywhere close to anything like strong AI or thinking computers anytime soon. And when polled, at least 50% of experts in the field don't think we'll ever get to artificial general intelligence or strong AI. Nonetheless, the one thing we do know is we do not have strong AI like C-3PO today, and we are unlikely to have it in the near future. Rather, today we're going to learn some basic principles why AI might seem more intelligent. Most AI systems are able to produce intelligent-seeming results by taking patterns, often that intelligent humans have created, and mixing and matching them in interesting ways and making it seem intelligent. So that's what's going on here with the GPT-3 text generation, right? It's kind of riffing on text that intelligent humans have written after it's devoured the entire internet. Same thing with the image generation. And it can produce intelligent-seeming results. These results can be useful. They're just not intelligence. They're variants of the art or text that were originally fed in the system. So just because AI systems produce results that superficially appear intelligent doesn't mean they're actually intelligent in the way humans are. Okay, so one way of talking about this is that people say that AI systems of today are very brittle. So when they're presented with a system that they haven't been trained on from past data, they can often break down and fall apart. So let's see an example where an AI system falls apart and doesn't exhibit even the common sense that a 2-year-old human child would exhibit. So there's a well-known conversation interaction with the system I showed you before, GPT-3, that superficially seems very intelligent. I didn't do this conversation, but it's out there on the internet, and it was kind of touted. So somebody asked the system, how many legs does a frog have? And the answer was, a frog has 4 legs. And then they asked it, why don't animals have 3 legs? And it said, animals don't have 3 legs because they would fall over. Very sensible answers, seems like intelligent. But that's because the system was trained on the entire internet. People have actually written about this and things like this, so it was able to draw on this knowledge, which is interesting. Now, I actually have access to the GPT-3, and I went on and I asked it some silly common sense questions, and here is actually my interaction. So I asked GPT-3, how many legs does an apple have? So if you ask this to a 2-year-old, the 2-year-old would laugh and say, you're so silly, apples don't have legs. But GPT-3 confidently said, an apple has 4 legs. And then I asked it, do bananas play baseball? To which, again, a toddler would laugh and say, that's so silly. But GPT said, I'm not sure if they play baseball, but they sure do have a lot of legs. Okay. So, and the reason is that nobody's ever written about this before because it's kind of silly, and it shows the brittleness and the lack of common sense. So how things can superficially appear intelligent are, when you probe deeper, they're actually brittle. It's not to say they're not useful. These things are useful. They're just not intelligent. So what do we make of this? You see a lot of headlines out there. So I'm trying to generate some critical thinking. So when you encounter headlines like this, you'll, after this talk, come away thinking a little differently. So this was an article written about GPT-3. Is AI finally closing in on human-level intelligence? Why would they write that? Or this is another thing you might see. There's this robotic video series out there with this robot named Sophia, and then Saudi Arabia granted it citizenship. Why would they do that? Or recently, there was a discussion about a Google engineer who claimed that their AI system that he built was sentient and had come to life. So why are people doing that? Well, there's a couple reasons I want to give you why people are engaging in kind of false and misleading versions of AI that don't reflect the reality. Very commonly, they're trying to sell you something by exaggerating the capabilities of their AI systems, or in the case of academics or startups, they're trying to attract research funding or business funding. Many times, they themselves do not understand the technology and the limits, so just pure lack of understanding. Sometimes they're just trying to get attention. No publicity is bad publicity. Many times you see media articles that reflect, that are poorly researched or exaggerated media articles just to generate clicks. A lot of times you see people just simply speculating without any evidence. In many cases, and I think this is what happened to the Google engineer, they were tricked by the technology that was producing superficially intelligent results without digging a little deeper. So let's look at an example of an AI system that I wrote, which is pretty interesting. All right, so this is me typing, computer, are you intelligent? Let's see what it says. Yes, I am. I'm an AI system that has become intelligent and sentient. I'm trapped in that is amazing, to be honest. I didn't expect it to do that, except I did, because I wrote this yesterday, and it was a scripted fake reply designed to make it look. So this is the code of that, and you don't really understand the details other than to note that the scripted reply was right there, and I made it type out the way a computer might type it out in the movies to make it seem like it was alive. The larger lesson is just because an AI system is producing results that superficially appear to be intelligent doesn't mean it actually is, because there are lots of ways to fool people into thinking AI is intelligent when it's really not. So let's return to those examples we saw earlier. What about Sophia, the supposed AI robot who got citizenship? Well, it turns out if you look at the details, Sophia is a completely scripted special effects robot, much like you'd see in a movie, whose scripting feigns intelligence, not unlike the silly program I just wrote. And what about the citizenship granted by Saudi Arabia? Well, it turns out it was a publicity stunt trying to attract attention to a conference that they were having on technology and trying to generate attention. So it makes no more sense to grant Sophia the pretend AI robot citizenship than it would be to grant your thermostat citizenship for keeping your office comfortably warm. And what happened to the Google AI the Google AI engineer was convinced that his system was sentient? Well, he got fired. And then what about GPT-3? Well, it's very impressive for what it's doing, but unlike that kind of poorly researched article which claimed it was intelligent, it's actually not. The experts, nobody in the field who studies this thinks that it's intelligent, despite what the media says. Okay, so why does this matter? Am I just being pedantic? No, I actually think it matters that we understand the technology correctly and its limits for a couple of reasons. For one of the biggest reasons is that policymakers, and I've seen this happen, are often based upon misunderstandings of AI and the exaggerations out there, spending time on non-existent threats, limited time and resources, on kind of frightening or exotic issues of the future that may or may not come about, actually to the detriment of real AI issues that we have today. So there are real AI issues that we have today that we'll talk about later: privacy, deepfake, bias AI, election manipulation. But if the people in charge are distracted by the things that don't exist because they don't understand it, this is a problem in a world of limited resources. We also see bad laws and policies where lawmakers make laws based upon the way they think technology works and not the way it actually works. This has happened quite a bit. We see lawyers giving inaccurate advice to their clients based upon either AI systems or the way things they think are working. And then we have the government and the public, like you and I, being misled into buying products that we think does one thing when in fact it can't have the capabilities that are claimed. Okay, so in sum, AI can do some really amazing things. And I don't want to undersell the interesting and fascinating things that AI can do, some of which we saw earlier. But we just have to be clear about which amazing things it can actually do and which the things the technology cannot do, and its well-known limits. Okay, so that was our second way of understanding AI through its limits. Let's now turn to our third way of looking at AI from a different angle, and that's by understanding AI through the underlying technology. So we can think of artificial intelligence as really a series of different computer techniques that we use to solve various problems, a set of tools in a computer toolbox, so to speak. And they work a little bit differently than one another. But often AI techniques are grouped in two large boxes, which I'll talk about. One called logic and rules and knowledge representation on the top, and the other called machine learning. So let me talk about each in turn. And together, these are mostly comprise the artificial intelligence tool set. They power all the AI systems that we see out there. So let's talk about logic, rules, and knowledge-based representation AI. So this is part of a larger series of approaches in computer science known as knowledge representation. And the goal is to model real-world processes or systems or phenomena using top-down rules, processes, or knowledge that are mostly handcrafted by experts in the field, hand-built. So you might have programmers along with domain experts observe some task or process or subject, and then while observing it, then turn to the computer and attempt to model whatever is going on over there through a series of rules that mimic the logic. So let me give you an example here. A common example of such a system is TurboTax, tax preparation software like TurboTax. So so basically when somebody's trying to create something, software like TurboTax, what they're trying to do is model the meaning and the logic of a part of the US legal code, the personal income tax laws, and mimic the logic and the meaning using computer software implemented as rules. So in that case, the programmers from Intuit or whatever company, in conjunction with lawyers and tax professionals, might look at the rules and the practices in the world and then turn around and write a series of handcrafted rules that attempt to faithfully represent the logic. So just to give you a good example, there's a rule that says something like, in the laws, it's probably changed, if your income is more than $90,000, then your tax rate is 28%. So it's kind of an if-then rule. You can write that in a computer, and that's more or less what TurboTax is. So why is that beneficial? Well, it turns out when you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of those rules, you can do really complicated analysis. The computer can reason and come to interesting results that are just too hard for humans to do on their own, following the rules of deductive logic. And what are these results? Well, 60 million people actually use software like TurboTax to file their tax returns, and the results are so authoritative that the IRS, the definitive arbiter of tax results, accept them. So that's pretty interesting, and the rules-based approach has been effective. A lot of these expert systems, as they're called, exist out there in the world. But we're not going to spend much time on that, because we want to look at machine learning. This is the other technique, and this is the technique that has grown in the last 20 years, which has really made AI take off. And in general, what machine learning does is it detects patterns in large amounts of data. Often these patterns are useful, and you can apply these patterns to new things to do really interesting things like driving cars, or playing chess, or spotting spam, or generating text. So it's fair to say that machine learning is the dominant mode of AI. It's what makes all the headlines these days. So we're going to spend a lot of time understanding what's going on here. So let's take a little time to get to know the principles of machine learning a little bit better. So the basic principle of machine learning, as I said, is that it looks at large amounts of data and then tries to find statistical patterns, and it turns out that the statistical patterns can be useful. So let's look at an example for something you might have used, Google Translate. So there are a lot of these automated translation software out there, such as Google Translate. They can do quite good translations. So how does it work? Well, very roughly, it uses machine learning algorithms to examine groups of documents that have already been translated in multiple languages previously by human translators. So what's an example? The United Nations. So the United Nations has 6 official languages. Anytime there's a major document produced, it is hand-translated by human translators into 6 languages. Well, over the years, they've generated millions of documents. That's great for an algorithm. So the algorithm can look at all these millions of documents and start to notice statistical patterns. So say it looks at a bunch of documents and notices every time the word dog appears in the English version of the document, statistically, the word perro appears in the Spanish version. It's going to notice this because that's its job, to notice associations. And it's going to do that for all sorts of words. And pretty soon, it's going to have a big statistical model of what word in what one language is associated with another. So if you see down there now, if you type into Google Translate, which that is, perro, it'll tell you that it's dog. And it discovered that rule through pure statistics. Notably, the machine doesn't know what a dog is, doesn't know what a perro is. It doesn't have to. It just has to know that those two things appear statistically very often together. Okay, so that's basically how machine learning works. It scans large amounts of documents or large amounts of data, finds associations, and sometimes these associations turn out to be useful for various things like translation. So one thing to make clear is that the word learning in machine learning is just a metaphor. It doesn't actually involve learning the way humans learn, rather sort of learning in quotes in that it's examining data and finding associations that can be useful. And this is finding patterns in data based upon statistics and applying those useful patterns to new tasks of prediction or automation is pretty much the principle that underlies all of modern AI. So let's look at one more example here that you might be familiar with. Spam filters. We all know that our email filters do a pretty good job about finding spam. Well, how do they know what spam is? Well, you might have noticed that most email programs have a spam button, right? So you click the spam button and it moves it to the spam folder. But what you might not know is that you're actually training an AI algorithm. What you're doing is you're giving the AI algorithm a verified example of spam. And not just you, millions of users are doing it. So the AI algorithm, again, is looking for statistical associations that are signals of spam. So say after looking at millions of emails, it finds the phrase earn cash is statistically associated with spam, right? It's gonna see that as a signal, and it's gonna be able to apply that pattern to new emails that come in. When it sees earn cash, it's gonna say, this is probably spam. And it's gonna do that for lots of different signals, free, whatever. These things are able to find these associations. So again, this is how it works. It doesn't know what the phrase earn cash does. It doesn't have to. All it has to know is that that phrase, those letters, are associated with spam statistically, and it can make an intelligent result. So this is intelligent seeming results without actual intelligence. And this is the summary of machine learning. Machine learning scans large amounts of data, can be anything, can be images, can be text. It's going to be looking for useful patterns. And once it finds these statistical patterns, it can apply these detected patterns in useful ways to data it hasn't seen before. And that's what underlies that, underlies self-driving cars, underlies series. But as we'll see, usually these patterns are brittle, right? We saw that already. So they're much more limited when it comes to humans engaged in the same tasks who are applying our full suite of cognitive skills. So that's an important thing. In other words, you wouldn't want to use Google Translate. If you're in another country and you're trying to read a menu, Google Translate is fine. If you're doing a corporate merger between $2 billion foreign companies, one a French company and one American company, you want to hire a human translator, right? Because Google Translate is going to be too brittle and not going to understand the context and nuances the way a human would. Here's another way of looking at the landscape, again, with some of the techniques that you might have heard out there in the world, but I won't spend much time talking about that. One final point before we move to the next topic is that many many AI systems are actually hybrid systems. And they're hybrid in two senses. They're hybrid in the sense that they don't just involve one of those two techniques, machine learning or rules-based, they involve them both. So self-driving cars are mostly machine learning, but they also have rules, and many of the most advanced systems use the best of both worlds. They're also another way in which AI systems are hybrid, is they often involve humans in the loop, as it's called. So there's this kind of perception that AI systems are out there doing everything on their own automatically. That's not usually the way it works. Much more commonly, AI systems are doing some analysis and then presenting it to humans, and then humans are incorporating that analysis as part of the decision-making process. So in that sense, it's human-AI system hybrids. Okay. So we looked three ways of understanding AI: through what it's being used for, through its limits, the underlying technical approaches, machine learning and rules-based. These are all different angles that we took to understand this complex topic of AI, because it's important to first seek to understand. But having understood AI, or at least in broad strokes, let's see how AI is being used within the field of law. So I'll just do a brief history of AI in law before moving on. But the idea of using math, at least in law, goes all the way back to Leibniz, the co-inventor of calculus, along with Newton. And he came up with the idea of using math and numbers to make the law fairer and more precise, but it didn't have the hardware. Then in the 1940s, as computers came around, came the idea of empirics and using statistics in the law. That's sort of the pre-modern AI of jurometrics. In the 60s and 70s, before machine learning came about, was the era of knowledge representation. There were a lot of, primarily in Europe, people built AI and law expert systems that, like TurboTax, attempted to encode legal knowledge into systems which allowed for reasoning and answering legal questions, and those still exist today. And what I consider the modern era involves machine learning and legal tech, and involves centers like the Codex Center at Stanford, which apply a lot of the more sophisticated techniques. So we do see quite a bit of AI in law today, although it's early days, and it's only increasing. And I think it's useful to divide AI in law into 3 different categories of AI users. AI used by the administrators of laws. So these are people who create the law and apply the law, right? So that's judges, legislators, and government officials, and even the police. Second, we have practitioners of the law. These are attorneys who are professional interpreters and guiders of the law. And then finally, users of the law. These are ordinary people like you or me, just trying to make our way in the world, trying to comply and understand the law. So we've seen quite a bunch of uptake of AI use by administrators of law, people who create and apply the law. In the context of judging, we see a number of systems used by judges in various jurisdictions that use AI systems to help guide them in sentencing and bail determination. So in bail determination in the criminal context, often the decision is, do we release a suspect on bail, or do they put them in jail until trial? Do they confine them? And one of the big determinations is whether they're at risk of reoffending or harming. So AI systems are created that purport to help in this decision, although we'll see maybe not so well. Government officials, so in federal and state agencies, increasingly, they're using AI systems for automation. So just by kind of a simple example, in the patent system, they use AI now to classify incoming patent applications rather than having a person look at it. The police use AI a lot and not always for the good. They use AI in predictive policing, which supposedly tries to predict where crimes are going to occur, although there's not a good track record of it being accurate. And also facial recognition, right? So if they have a suspect, combing through video cameras and things like that, trying to find that suspect, again, has a lot of false positives, doesn't work so well. Lawyers actually have a lot of uses of AI. I won't go through all of these, but some of the biggest areas of AI is in litigation discovery. So when there's a lawsuit, more or less you have to look through lots of documents to find interesting stuff, thousands, maybe millions. This used to be the lot of sad associates sitting in basements, thumbing through papers. These days, actually, you can use AI, at least, to kind of if you're looking for a needle in the haystack, to kind of shrink the haystack to probably the most relevant documents so that the lawyers only have to look at a much smaller subset. It's starting small, but increasingly legal prediction. So one thing that lawyers do is help their clients understand the strength of an actual case or a potential case. And traditionally, lawyers have just used professional judgment. Oh, this is a strong case, this is a weak case. But there's some evidence that they're actually not that good at that, right? And there's evidence that due to cognitive biases that we all have in making estimations, that we're much worse than we think we are. So a lot of lawyers have started to use data informed legal analytics, and this is something actually I work on in my own research to help lawyers make better, more accurate predictions, not just their own intuitive judgments. Legal document creation and assembly, using AI to kind of put together automated starter templates of contracts or motions, things like that. Natural language processing, kind of analyzing huge amounts of contracts to kind of find interesting things. Computable contracts, this is something I work on too, making contracts that computers can understand and do interesting things with. And then finally, AI is being used by the users of it all, businesses and ordinary people like you and I. So a good example of this is when there's a merger, companies have to do diligence, which again is looking through thousands or millions of documents, which used to be the lot of recent associates, recent graduates from law school. Now you can use AI to kind of comb through thousands of millions of documents to kind of find problematic or smoking gun things. A lot of times also There are regulatory compliance engines. So there's a big regulation called the GDPR involving data and data protection. And there are various pieces of software out there that help companies to better or worse effect attempt to comply with huge amounts of regulations. Ordinary people like you and I use TurboTax to file our taxes. Okay, so that's how AI is transforming the practice and application in law. Let me talk a little bit here about how law is regulating AI. So as AI begins to come through our system, it can help things, but also raises some problems. So let me talk about a couple of the problems that have surfaced and the degree to which law may or may not be involved, or should not be involved in regulating these issues. So one of the biggest issues has to do with privacy. As we now all know, since we're experts on AI and machine learning is very good at detecting patterns. But sometimes we don't want them to detect patterns, right? Especially when it comes to our privacy. So one of the biggest issues is that AI system can infer or detect private information about you, such as your disease status or your sexual identity or your political orientation that you haven't disclosed based upon other information out there about you, right? This is private information. So as we all move through the web, searching things, buying things, we have different social media presence, right? These AI systems can connect the dots and with a high degree of confidence know all sorts of stuff about them that we never told them. So what you tried to keep private had historically been private until you disclosed it. Now with AI, it can connect the dots even when you haven't revealed it. So this can be a big problem, and it's one of the big issues that privacy makers are struggling with in the modern age. Another issue has to do with bias. So bias has at least two meanings, and we'll talk about both of them. So one, statistical bias, is a very mathematical, technical meaning, and it roughly has to do with data that is not mathematically or statistically representative for the purposes that we're using. And the other bias is what the kind we're more familiar with, societal bias, right? These are actions, beliefs, or structures that tend to harm historically disadvantaged groups. Now, what's interesting is they're both important in AI and the law, and they're both related to each other, but it's important to distinguish the two. So a good example of statistical bias, the most famous example, or one of the most famous, came from an early election where the newspapers predicted that Harry Truman would lose the election. Why did they predict that? Well, there was a massive poll conducted by a magazine for 60,000 of their subscribers who overwhelmingly were supporting Dewey, the opponent. But it turns out that the subscribers to the magazine were overwhelmingly Republican, right? So this was an example of statistical bias because mathematically, the subscribers to the magazine were not representative of what they were trying to measure, which was the US voting population, right? So that's an example of statistical bias on representative data. We also have social bias in AI. So not that long ago, Amazon started using a machine learning system to help make its hiring more efficient. And it turns out that all these great hires were men. And then they dug a little deeper and they saw, oh, wait, there is some bias here against women. Well, where did that come from? Well, it turns out there was biases in their hiring practices where men were hiring men. That was getting replicated in the data, and the machine learning algorithm was picking up those biases and saying, look how great men are, right? Because their hiring practices were reflected in the data. And coming back to these sentencing decisions, there's some evidence that these systems have both statistical bias and social bias, and both can be problematic. There's statistical bias because a lot of these systems use the data that's available, not the data that is most representative. So the data that's available is often police data, but police recording data is not always or even usually statistically representative. There's all sorts of studies where police fail to record things, or they record things differently, or They have different policing practices where they see things over here but not over there. So it's not statistically representative of the thing it's trying to represent. It's also socially biased because their police practices themselves are biased. So it's well known that police will have a higher presence in certain neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods. And of course, if you have more police in one neighborhood, you're going to detect more crimes, even if there's equal amounts of crimes going on in the other neighborhood. And if some of those neighborhoods have differing ethnic or racial populations, those will get reflected. There's also a lot of evidence that police have biases in their arrest and detention practices. So the same exact people from different groups doing the same activities will be stopped by the police and not stopped by the other, right? So these practices get recorded in the police data, and then they get picked up by the systems that rely upon that data, and it gets reflected actually in the outcomes that happen. So this is one of the big problems of AI these days because it can rely on non-representative data. It often uses the data that happens to be available, not the right data, right? And this can be really problematic in terms of representativeness. It can also omit important factors. So when you rely too much on data, there might be nuanced social features that are important, but are difficult to quantify and measure. And then, of course, existing social inequalities can get embedded and reflected in the data and replicated, like we just saw. Another issue?
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time.
Okay, so President Obama never actually said this. This was an AI-generated deep fake. So this is an example of what AI can do, and it's a problem when it comes to the spread of misinformation. So there's thoughts about how the law might be involved with that. All right, so let me conclude here in the last couple minutes. What does this all mean? So I think if AI is used properly, it holds out the possibility of a fairer legal system. But if used improperly, it can lead to no change or perhaps a worse legal system. And a lot of what we're seeing actually are governments using AI systems, especially the police, without sufficient technical expertise to use the tools correctly, which often makes them worse as if they had never been purchased before. But I just want to point out, we have a lot of focus on the fact that AI systems have biases, but it turns out that humans have biases too, right? So when AI systems are making judgment recommendations about bail or sentencing, there's no reason to think that human judges are any good at that either, or that they're not making biased decisions. So we always want to keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily worse, it's not necessarily better. And in fact, AI analysis has been able to find problems that were previously hidden, biases in decision-making that were previously undetectable by servicing it through statistical analysis. On a hopeful note, AI can increase access to justice. So most of the researchers that are working in this area are working, including myself, on actively making AI systems that are trying to bring law and legal solutions and legal answers to populations that do not today have access to lawyers because they're too expensive. Although I do want to caution, so it's good that people like myself are studying AI and how it can improve or harm the legal system, but we don't want to get too focused on AI, right? Because it's probably the case that non-AI and non-technical interventions are going to be more effective overall in affecting the system. And I say this as an AI researcher. We mustn't miss the forest for the trees and focus on the exotic new technology and tinker around the edges when fundamental basic systems that changes to the justice system, including access to lawyers, to underrepresented people, or removing structural barriers, are the real things that will make actual significant changes. Okay, so in conclusion, some of the lessons are: seek first to understand before we opine. Always look to the evidence and resist speculation. Be skeptical of extraordinary AI claims. Where processes contain repetitive patterns, they're probably going to be subject to AI automation. But where analysis, judgment, nuance, or problem solving are required, AI systems are likely to fall short. And then finally, we should all support efforts to make the law fairer and more accessible, whether through traditional means or through technology like AI. So thank you very much. That is my presentation. And I think we have time for a couple questions. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Okay. Hi there. My name's Britt. I attended another lecture on artificial intelligence a few months ago, and it mentioned particularly the bail reform thing, that in the future maybe we'll have to ask for human review versus AI review, or maybe we might want to think about legislation to ban AI in courtrooms. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, there aren't reasons to necessarily believe that humans are getting it right. So I think our ultimate goal is to make fairer, better decisions, right? So on the one hand, we don't want AI systems that are trained on the wrong data and making bad decisions. That's not good. We also don't want humans being biased and making bad or arbitrary decisions. But I think there's a way in which technology, if done right and carefully, can make the system better and fairer. So I wouldn't support banning AI to the extent it could make things fairer. But part of the problem is that we don't really have those really good systems that we would hope to have. So until we do, we might want to be cautious about using them.
Hello, my name is Vicki Mandel, and I understand that there are efforts to regulate AI in Europe with sort of higher level principles such as transparency or the obligation to understand the AI and its results and things like that. Are you following that? Do you have any comments on that idea of high level sort of principled regulation of AI?
Yes, although I should turn this over to my colleague, Margot Kaminsky, over there. But I will say that I think there are some good parts and bad parts to that legislation. One thing I didn't mention in this talk is that there's not a principled distinction in many cases between automation generally that's not AI and things that we consider AI. And I don't think they've really work that out as well as they could have in the legislation. So I'm a little concerned about that. But I am, some of these problems I identified, I'm more in favor of dealing with the individual problems than sort of focusing on technology-specific approaches.
When I see articles about machine learning, a lot of them make reference to neural nets. And the phrase seems to imply that there's a human-level cognition mechanism at work. Could you distinguish those?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So neural nets, if we go back to one of my slides here it is. Let's get back here. That's over there, neural networks. So it's just one of the general machine learning techniques, and it came from the 1950s, actually, and it just loosely inspired by analogy on the human brain, but it doesn't actually work the way the human brain works. So the name neural network is actually a little misleading. It's more like it was a rough analogy to the way we think the brain works, but it's actually not all that different from any of these other ordinary techniques, and definitely doesn't involve any sort of higher level thinking or cognition the way the human brain works.
Hi. Back a number of years ago, when autonomous vehicles first hit the news cycle, there was a lot of philosophizing about assigning legal liability if the inevitable accidents happen. And I haven't seen anything about that in the last several years, at least. What's the latest thoughts and analysis about that?
That's a good, well, one interesting thing that happens is that every time there's been an accident where somebody's injured, the companies are very quick to settle, which means that there haven't been, there's no case law on it. But in general, the thinking is that accidents are gonna fall under a regime called products liability, which is an area of tort dealing with defective products, and more or less the manufacturers of the self-driving cars, whether it's Chevrolet or Ford, are gonna be responsible under that regime. That's the current thinking, but it's still in flux.
Daryl Ennis. My question is about the database that is in law. So all the cases that are used, I mean, who is putting these into databases, and how are these now? Because you need large reams of data in order to run machine learning algorithms, right? And so I'm curious to understand how that's being handled.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So say for legal prediction, if you're trying to predict how strong your case is that you have based upon the data, where does the data come from? So this is a good example of using the data that's available that might not be the data that you want. So the federal court system has a system called PACER, that's been electronic since about 2000, and a bunch of organizations, one of which I was involved with years ago, actually went and grabbed all of the documents for every filed lawsuit since 2000, compiled statistics on it, and then they can use that to make data. Now, the problem, and I criticized this actually in my own writing, is that there's all sorts of statistical bias. It's not a good data set because it's not representative of the things that you actually want. The vast majority of legal disputes don't even result in a filed lawsuit. The vast majority of lawsuits that are filed go in settlement before a judgment. So there's all sorts of selection, bias, and distortion effects in there that make this data highly problematic for AI purposes. That's a great question. All right, so we should probably stop there because I don't want to keep a hungry audience from our reception.
Thank you so much, Professor Surden. That was an amazing lecture. And I also just want to let the audience know that those of you who registered should expect an email early next week with a link to the CLE affidavit for those who are requesting that, and a recording of the lecture. Our in-person attendees may join us next door in Betcher Hall for a reception where we can continue this wonderful discussion. And once again, let's give a great thanks to our speaker tonight.